Hey guys, it's your boy Donny here. Another episode of Donny's Takes. It's been definitely been a minute. I appreciate all the emails and messages I've been getting. I miss you guys too. Honestly, I've just been really busy. As I said, I had a death in the family that was very sudden and unexpected. Had a newborn. I bought a farm. Running multiple businesses, and honestly I'm just trying to really engage in my community and build a lot of grassroots things that are pretty under wraps right now, but I'm hoping in the future I can speak a bit more about them. But anyways, today I had a little bit of time, so I thought I would shoot a video here in my new studio, and I want to talk about the rise of Nick Fuentes and the death of conservatism. And so, many of you people are probably aware of a character called Nick Fuentes. He is obviously very polarizing. He's rose to prominence fairly recently. I've actually been following him for a few years, here and there, and kind of predicted his rise a couple years ago, basically seeing a lot of the shortcomings of the conservative movement broadly. Not just here where I live in Canada, but also in America, and almost the philosophy of modern conservatism, seeing it dying over time, seeing its hollowness, and ultimately I think Nick is the final nail in the coffin. And so a lot of people will characterize Nick as simply, a far-right Nazi. He flirts with, especially in the past, he's flirted with these concepts of being pro-Hitler, and also it's kind of a mix of LARPing and joking around, but also seeing, I think, also adult conversation around history and how history has been manipulated, as well. That I think he's broken a lot of secret cows on those issues specifically, which we can maybe get into another time. But what I want to speak to today is just kind of where I see things moving in the political landscape, and why they're doing that. So, for Nick Fuentes specifically, I see his rise to fame as a result of the total and complete failure of the philosophy of conservatism in the West. I see that both happening here in Canada, America obviously, but Europe. And so we have to ask ourselves, what is conservatism and what has it been? Well, obviously in the name, it's to conserve. But if you ask any conservative involved in politics today, what are we conserving? Most of their arguments, most of their policies, most of their positions are simply a knee-jerk reaction to the left, in terms of their resistance to the left and to progress. And while you say, well, that is the job of conservatism, well, if we look back on history, there's been many visionary conservatives. And, Reagan was one. I'm not a huge Reagan fan, like a lot of older generation, but he was somebody who came with a bold vision for America, and he enacted it, and we've seen these characters in Canada as well, bold visions. But conservatives, I would say, for several generations now, have lacked vision entirely. Their only real arguments, platforms, policy are just derailing those of the left. Now, yes, there have been many problems, especially with the modern left. I don't think we need to go into extreme detail there, but I would characterize some of these problems as financial illiteracy, which leads to multi-trillion-dollar policy ideas, environmental extremism to the point of being anti-human, as well some of the issues around gender and things of this nature, racial reparations, all of these things are kind of the extreme fringes of the left, which I think, if we're honest, the pendulum is now swinging in the other direction. I think we had kind of a decade of this wokeism. It kind of peaked. I think Elon marked the start of the switch backward. And what we're heading to is, I believe, white nationalism and probably far-right conservatism. I think that is the future for the next foreseeable future in North America. I think Canada is a bit behind the times in terms of politically switching that way, but I think we will see it here in Canada as well. And so, again, conservatives. For people who vote conservative, especially people my age, they feel almost more portrayed by conservatives than they do liberals or even far lefties. And why would that be? It's because not only has conservatives, not only do they not have vision, they stab you in the back. They pretend to actually be your friends. They pretend to be an actual solution, or a stop to the pain and suffering caused by the modern left. But they don't. They, at best, conservatives maybe slow down the train of far left extremism, if you will, maybe 10-20%. They're totally unable to, they're so out of touch with the modern generation that it's not even funny at this point, Conservatism, has been called almost, classical liberalism, limited governments. We have libertarianism, the idea of small government or no government. We have the idea of, conservatives is keep more of your paychecks. Tax cuts. All of these things are kind of conservative. Less regulations on, drilling and production. These things, right? But conservatives at no point have actually really fundamentally challenged any of the worldview of the left. And that's why they've been so unsuccessful relative to the left culturally. Yes, Trump is in power now, but honestly, who knows what will happen? I think it's either going to go more extreme right somehow. I don't see somebody for 2028 yet necessarily feeling that, role, or we'll see. Maybe it'll be Vance. I don't know. But anyways, my point is that conservatives haven't, so liberals, or the left, the modern left, which I would characterize as fairly extremist and radical, and that's not all people on the left, to be clear. I would just say the policies of this trans and gender stuff, and basically communist level, socialism, if you want to call it that, and all these things. We have a lot of extremists. The left has an extremist problem, right? And so does the right, and we're going to get into that today as well. But what the left has done well, and why the conservatives, I think, have failed culturally relative to the left, is that the left are visionaries. Now, I don't like their vision, personally, but they actually at least pretend to care about people. They actually promote certain policies that actually show that they do care. And they actually speak to a lot of the struggles that people are facing financially, right? This is no more apparent. People look to Trump as the last bastion to save America, save the economy, all these things, right? Well, what has Trump really done so far? Yeah, he's done some things on the margins. Tariffs, I think personally are a big mess, but some people might think, hey, we're bringing it back. But Trump's cut $600 billion to healthcare, right? And he's added to the military budget, and he made one of the biggest tax cuts on corporations and the rich in the history of America, quietly, right? Those are basically the things he's offered, right? So Trump was voted in on the idea of securing the borders, deporting illegals, making things safe, boosting the economy, making America great again, and he really hasn't done that. And it's pretty obvious to everybody now, right? The Epstein files are a whole other thing that we'll get into, but I think the fact that Trump was fighting the release of those files for so long, I think is very interesting in itself, and I think a lot of things are going to play out there. But anyways, my point is, broadly speaking, with Trump, let's just focus on Trump for a minute. Trump is a generational figure. Once in a generation, a Trump comes along. Somebody who's inspiring, has aura, who, totally flips the deck. He is kind of like like when Reagan came out, it was like, we have an actor here who is calling out the power establishment, who's outside of the system, and that very much was who Trump was. Trump had a record amount of people voted for Trump who had never voted before. He inspired a generation of politics. He's, without Trump, you wouldn't have a Nick Fuentes, you wouldn't have a lot of these conservative and white nationalists and Christian nationalists influencers today. You just wouldn't. So Trump very much was the spark for that, but I think Trump is already cooked. I think it's over. And why? It's because ultimately he was still, even though he brought in the populist movement, the idea of, setting policies that actually help the people versus the donors and the elite class, he never really fulfilled that, right? In the end, in my opinion, and it's very sad to see, because I think he was hope for the world, right? He was a challenge against the establishment. He was a symbol, at least, this idea of the working class, that a free market and good policies and in a well-protected border, like, a country can operate without extreme socialism kind of idea. And I think he's just failed, and it's very sad to see. I personally think they had blackmail on him. I also think he was just a narcissist from the start. Having said that, like, I always thought he was hilarious. I think he's done some great things. I don't think he's literally, Hitler or whatever you want to say that the left has characterized him. But honestly, it's really sad to see that he's just nothing. I think he's a lame duck now. But anyways, he was, I think, the last of this idea of the old ideas of conservatism, where they basically are only resisting the extremities of the left with no real vision. Trump did have some vision, but I think that vision's gone. And ultimately, why I think the left is, I think we're getting both. We're going to have people our age my age are going to be hyperpolarized. And I think boomers and even Gen X don't really understand that this is coming, hyperpolarization. And what's interesting is a lot of the far left and the far right are both hitting on a lot of points that conservatism never did. And so conservatism, I think, especially in my generation, is totally morally bankrupt. They've never delivered on any promises. They haven't meaningfully resisted the right, or the left, I should say. The left has put through their frame or their worldview for reality, right? That we have marginalized minorities, that gender is a social construct, that we have to actually protect racial groups and minorities, with force. We have to help the middle class and lower class, right? We actually have to, forgive student loan debts. We have to, all of these things that the right says, oh, this is just communism, right? Which you could argue it is, in a way. All of these types of things as well. The idea, of it's racial identity politics. And I think that's actually the crux. So identity politics, I think, is the future, and that's why we see the rise of the far right and why the left culturally has won so much. So a lot of the conservatism, especially that comes from kind of the boomer era, it relies on Austrian economics, even though they don't follow that at all. But also it's the idea of the Enlightenment, and the ideals of the Enlightenment were that all men are created equal under God, that We judge somebody by their moral character, not by their race or immutable characteristics. Sneeze here. Excuse me. Yeah. All of these things, we hold these truths to be self-evident. All men are created free and equal. That's very much Enlightenment values, right? So when people say I'm a conservative but identify as a classical liberal, they're basically identifying with these suite of philosophies that, which is characteristic of the Enlightenment, which is kind of the backbone of a way of the philosophy of conservatism. It's been very corrupted. Obviously, they don't stick to it. But these kind of ideas, right? So in that, what do we see now? We have rapidly declining birth rates throughout the world, especially in North America. We're well below replacement levels. The debts are going exponential. People aren't able to afford homes. This is causing a lot of social instability. Generally speaking, leadership doesn't really, especially conservative leadership, there's no real emphasis on, like, they're so out of touch with people and their daily plight. It's absurd, right? You've never seen such a gap between what politicians say, what their priorities are, versus what the average person on the street is. Like, we all see it. People are really suffering. People are struggling to make ends meet. I mean, apathy and deaths of despair are an all-time high. I lost one of the closest people in my life. They took their own life unexpectedly, a death of despair, and I'm still coping with it. And it's very much a reality in our world today. And so the conservative idea is that, well, if we just built more pipelines, if we just lowered taxes on corporations, if we just let you keep a little bit more of your paycheck, everything's going to be okay. And it's just not true. And while I think, especially here in Canada, we should do a lot more to boost the economy, I think it's a crime what they've done to this economy. We should all be vastly more wealthy than we are today. I won't argue that point. I agree with it 100%. But, especially here in Alberta, yes, we need to produce more of our energy, and it needs to be, anyways. But that's actually not like a vision for success, right? So we have declining birth rates, despair, financial issues, and if we actually, moving forward, we see that all populations are going to, the native populations are crumbling. So that's, like, in comes mass immigration. So all of, both in America and here in Canada even more so, they're bringing in millions and millions of foreigners. Now it's very little discrimination, and they're even paying them, I think in Canada some families can get up to 80 grand a year to just come here, which is insane, right? And meanwhile, there's no real policies to help grow families for, helping new home buyers, helping, people of our generation. The boomers hold 80% of all the assets. They still hold most of the political power. And then all of the people our age are in this mess where, it's almost impossible to buy a home. We see, foreigners flooding our streets. All these things are happening at once, right? It's a pretty big, crime's going up, social cohesion is collapsing, healthcare systems are collapsing, all of these things, right? Meanwhile, conservatives, especially in America, they're worried about foreign wars still in Iran and supporting Israel, and they think literally Putin is the biggest number one problem in the world and the most evil person in the world. I don't like Putin, but they're obsessed with these kind of like Cold War era issues when they don't realize that people in my generation are really struggling, and conservatives have literally no ideas for them whatsoever beyond saying, if you vote for me, like, I'll give you maybe a reduction in taxes, tax on tips, and if you're lucky, we'll build a pipeline or two. Well, that's not really a vision for success. And so that's where the left comes in. The left says, hey, we actually care about you. We want childcare services for you. We want to fund more social programs for you. You know, I don't like a lot of their policies. I think they're stupid. But the conservatives are trapped in this idea where they say, well, because of Austrian economics, we can't just print money. We can't just forgive student loans. We can't just, print trillions of dollars and give it out to people. We can't just build homes. Well, yes, in an Austrian economic perspective, you shouldn't do that, and you can't do that because, inflation will come home to roost. But they do it anyway. They just don't do it for the people, right? They'll spend $1 trillion a year to go kill people and have 1,000 military bases throughout the world to uphold their order, to help Israel and help their allies. They'll print money for all their special interest groups. They'll give it away to corporations. They'll give tax cuts for people who don't need tax cuts. But obviously for the poor, right? They'll bail out the banks, right? But they won't bail out the people. And so this is where I think the crux of, let's not even talk about white nationalism. Let's just talk about nationalism and populism broadly, right? So people are now saying, hey, you're doing all these things for the rich. Why don't you do them for us? And that's honestly the argument that the left uses, and it's actually very powerful, and it's a winning argument. To me, I think theoretically, I want a much smaller government. I used to be a libertarian. I'm not really anymore. I would like a vastly smaller state and way more enshrined rights, especially here in Canada. It's just totally insane. But having said that, my politics have changed in that I say, well, if we can just print money, we should, if we can just do that, and if we're doing it anyways, we should do it to actually help many people as possible, especially those at the bottom. And I honestly think this is a winning argument, and this is where Nick Fuentes' a lot of the underlying philosophy actually of America First is that if you are a powerful nation, right, you actually can just do things, right? And we can actually change things for the better. Our politicians don't care about us anywhere, right? They're apathetic, they're all on the take. But they've convinced us of issues that actually have very little effect and meaning on our everyday lives. And they do nothing for our actual everyday lives. So that is where the future is, broadly, is that any politician, and we're seeing this almost healing of the left and the right, or coming together, where they're saying like, hey, and I believe most of modern conservatives, Ben Shapiro, Daily Wire, all these people, were intentionally there to create division and strife. Because if we actually sit down and have honest conversations, there are very deep, insurmountable differences between the left and the right. Culturally, think about a Christian versus a far left, atheist, whatever. There's issues there, but I think many, especially in our generation, agree that, hey, we should actually, if we're going to have a state, if we're going to have a country, we want people to actually flourish. And we want people to actually do better than previous generations. And if we're going to spend money on policies, it should be for our country first. And it shouldn't be for foreign nations. And we shouldn't be wasting money, right? And that's very powerful. Ben Shapiro, he's falling. He's basically cooked now. But his whole thing was trying to create strife, on micro issues, right? Ben, totally against forgiving student loan debt, but funding Israel all day, every day, right? And, just think of that. I think it's pretty irresponsible to, America's whole student loan thing is a whole can of worms. I think it's government intervention in the first place that's made the tuition so high. You can get into all these factors, but ultimately just think about it this way. Wiping out 100, 200K debt for young people would literally be the best thing you could do to help those people out. Because that is like an anchor or a millstone around their neck for the rest of their life. And in America, you can't even get forgiveness. Now, I totally agree. they consented. They shouldn't have got into that amount of debt, and it rewards people who didn't pay versus people who paid. Okay, I totally agree, but just think about it. If you actually forgave that debt, what's helping America more? Forgiving that debt or bombing Iran? Forgiving the debt. Let's just be honest, right? Many policies are the same, right? We have infinite money for bullshit stuff all over the world. We have no money for people on the ground, right? Homelessness is an all-time high. Sorry, free market, bro, bootstraps. Meanwhile, we're going to, fund endless wars in Ukraine, fund stupid shit all over the place, right? And so people just had enough, and especially as conditions deteriorate, the tension is going to raise up, and as well, racial tensions. And so that's where kind of the next iteration of populism we're seeing now is a white identitarianism, white nationalism, Christian nationalism. Now that's a boogie word. It's a lot of people call it, the rise of fascism, the rise of Nazism. Let's table that for now. What we're seeing now is that, taking a few steps back, when we're talking about the ideas of the Enlightenment, right? The European ethos back to Enlightenment was this idea, again, that all men are created equal. That's why the British were the first to eradicate slavery or to make slavery illegal, followed by America. Because it was ultimately these ideas, although imperfect, won out over time. But to maybe the detriment, if you will, I won't even pass a judgment on it, but let's just say that was baked into our philosophy, our education system for generations. White specifically, and of European descent. So, for myself, and for all of my friend groups and family groups, I had never thought about myself as a racial group or a part of a racial group. I grew up in a very white town, but when I lived in big cities, I had a lot of foreign friends. I didn't care. I judged people always on their merits, if I liked them, if I didn't like them. There's a lot of white people I don't like. There's a lot of, people of color that I do like. So my best friends are Indian. I never thought about that. And I thought even the idea, the idea of racism broadly was repugnant to me. Having said that, in Canada, we've had a lot of Indian immigration for a long time. So there were certain areas of Canada, like Brampton specifically, for my Canadian friend, where it was like 60-70% Indian from the time I was a kid. So I remember being in those areas and it being very shocking to me, and I felt very uncomfortable. But it was just almost like, oh, that's just this little area. And I never thought more about it, right? I know that I didn't feel comfortable around these people. They did feel like foreigners. They didn't feel like they were amalgamating into our culture. But it was such a small area, and, it wasn't a big deal. You'd have some people who I would deem as way more racist who would call it out and say they're taking over, they're coming. And I would just say, I would brush those people away because I thought it was offensive. Because, again, I thought we need to judge people on their merits. I think we're all brainwashed at a young age that racism is a bad thing, it's an evil, and it's very uncomfortable. To talk about race generally in any disparaging way, or even really acknowledge it exists. As well, so on the left, they've actually done a few interesting things philosophically. So I think our culture generally has promoted this, all men and women are created equal. But the left was the first, and this is for decades, is to acknowledge that that's not really true. There are distinct identity groups, and they are all vying for power. And this is kind of the backbone of far-left progressivism, that they look at the whole world as a power play, a grab for power. It's different groups all fighting for power, and there's oppressed groups, right, and there's, leader groups, and the goal of politics is to fight for this power. And that, different groups have different interests, and they're not always aligned. And that some of their some of the wants and desires of one group are antithetical to the desires of other groups. Conservatism has just totally rejected this, and I think to their detriment. And this is, I think, the final nail in the coffin of traditional conservatism, is that although in theory I agree with this, I think on an individual level, we need to judge people by their merits, right? I just think all people, I believe in God. I think all people are created under God. We need to honor life as sacred. I think we get into very bad positions when we demoralize and dehumanize people. But having said that, whites, we would say things like whiteness doesn't exist, but then at the same time say, white people are, the top, predators, top positions of power. So they would actually, at the same time, kind of brainwash people to say, like, whiteness doesn't exist, but also it's like a sin to be white. So we've created like white guilt and white hatred. And actually, a lot of those people were not actually whites promoting that. They were of a different race that often get confused for white. That's a different story altogether. But so we've had this culture where people have been internalizing white hatred while simultaneously, like this for whites, we've been internalizing white hatred. You're a bad guy simply because of your skin color, but then also kind of saying on the right, it's like, well, race doesn't really exist. And so this is the fracturing of the movement that's happening now. Is people like Nick Fuentes come in and they say, hey, white people do exist. We're a distinct racial group. We come from European ancestry. We actually have a lot to be proud for. We are, we created the city of Rome, right? We was Romans. We're responsible for most of philosophy in the world, the architecture, construction, Catholicism and Protestantism, most of the inventions in the world, the modern economy, transportation system, circumnavigation, all of these things that our ancestors have accomplished that are actually very notable, very pride-inducing, and when you start to actually realize, just in Canada, the first settlers and the people who came and colonized this space, these are ancestors worthy of our praise, worthy of our admiration, and as well with white people generally, we have a lot to be proud of, and so this is where the problem and tension arises, is that we're going from white people don't exist, and if you do think you exist, it's because you suck, to, hey, we're actually pretty awesome. And we are a distinct racial group. And once that genie is out of the bottle, I don't think there's really any turning back. Because I think whites have been the last group to actually realize that we were a distinct racial group with our own interests, broadly speaking, versus other populations. And this is a very hard truth to swallow, but all other races act this way already. The ideas of the Enlightenment are, I think on paper, make a lot of sense. I think it's, as a theoretical ideal, is correct. I think maybe under the eyes of God, yes. But in society, it doesn't operate this way. So the blacks in America got this in the 60s. That's why they heavily organized, and that's how they got political power. Now, that's a whole can of worms itself. I'm probably going to trigger a lot of people. But the blacks identified that they were a distinct group. They organized together for common causes, and they gained enough political power to affect change in society. Now, the idea of mass, of both the conservatives and, for mass immigration, right? You'll have the left say these are almost like our duty because we colonize these lands. We should have endless immigration, and they're minorities, so we need to let them in. That's basically their argument. The right says, well, it's an economic booster, and you're Canadian simply because you have a piece of paper that makes you Canadian, right? You arrive here, we tell you when you're a Canadian, you have a special piece of paper, you're on magic soil, that makes you a Canadian. And I think this worked well when immigration, or, was at 5%, foreign-born people, or, 5% or non-Canadian. But now we're coming up on 30%, and in the next decade, you're coming up on 50% plus will be, foreign-born, non-Canadians. And that's what's causing a lot of the tension, right? So as economic conditions deteriorate, it's never been harder to find a job. Debts, inflation, all of these things. We're bringing in mass loads of people who don't look like us, don't speak like us, who we don't really relate to, who we don't really connect with, who we feel uncomfortable around. And we're told these people are almost the future, that are just as Canadian as you. And in fact, they're getting preferential treatment. So you can see how this is probably going to lead to some type of civil war. Unfortunately, and I don't advocate for that, but you can just really do the math on this. You see it forward, right? It's not going to be pretty. And so that's why we have the rise of Fuentes, and where a lot of conservatives' arguments are falling flat, because you have groups of whites who in the West are still majority. I think in America it's only 50%. I think in Canada right now it's like 70%. Maybe less now. But, we see our standard of living falling. We're starting to become aware of the fact that, hey, as whites, we actually are a distinct group. We have a lot to be proud of. That we actually have interests that we should protect. That politics should reflect our interests. That we shouldn't, just, I don't care about tax cuts for corporations or simply one more pipeline. I actually want to be able to buy a home. I want to, do things that actually help me. I don't want millions of people, foreigners who barely speak my language, who are getting in accidents or committing crimes, who are destabilizing what was a homogenous, stable society. I don't want them flooding into my country. And I see the conservative movement as totally unable to address those. That's why the far right is happening. So for people who don't understand that it's all of these conditions combined, that's what's leading to this movement. And so while I think ultimately, I think it's good that whites broadly understand that we're one of multiple identity groups. I think broadly, I really want to see more of a unity between the far left and the far right. Yes, I don't like communism. I don't like a lot of those things. But again, let's be pragmatic, right? Back to the idea of the student loan debt. I personally would rather forgive student loan debt than fund a war to bomb people, right? But as well, I would rather build homes for the homeless versus fund new immigrants, right? These are Canada First, America First policies, right? And so, yeah, that's kind of where we're at right now. And I see the future as being very unstable. I think we're getting into issues where, it's going to be pretty messy, if I'm honest with you. And that's really how I see things. I actually do see violence as inevitable. I don't like violence. I would never call for violence. But again, when you have, I think it's 5% of the population a year coming into Canada or more. We're the fastest growing country in the world. That can't continue without a level of social unrest that will get bad. In fact, there was an RCMP report. That's our police in Canada. And they basically, they hit it and it got released, and they said, we're predicting a level of civil unrest in Canada because people don't realize how poor they are, and I also think it's this racial issue as well. And so then you see groups organizing against that, and rightly so, because it's a knee-jerk reaction to this, and conservatism is totally dead. And so the opposite is that, hey, we're actually a proud group of white people who believe we have a right to exist. We believe this is our country. We don't want, we don't want it to be run by, like, we don't want all Indians in our country. And honestly, I really empathize with that sentiment. I think Canadians are a beautiful, distinct people, and I think we have beautiful lands that we should protect. And as well, what I think the far right won't admit is that people aren't having kids. If you actually look at it over time, I mean, the populations are going off a cliff. Like, I did the number, I think it's like 0.7 kids per woman. It's insane in Canada. It's insane. And that's with mass immigration. And so it's happening. And, one other thing which I think is a revolutionary idea that I think the left got for a long time, that the far right or white nationalism, whatever you want to call, is getting, is that conservatives treat countries as simply economic zones, economic activity zones. Their god is the GDP. The GDP has to go up. Is the GDP going up? Great. That is, like, the gods are happy. Is the GDP going down? Well, then we failed, right? Our whole goal in life is GDP, and we are just cogs of the wheel of GDP. That's literally your only, position in life, is to grow the GDP. Did you grow the GDP? It's like Uncle Sam's poster. I want you to grow the GDP. That's literally all conservatives cared about. And, but what we're actually getting, this consciousness is growing, this idea that countries are more than simply economic zones. Countries are an amalgamation of people, a distinct group, with distinct interests, who I think have title and rights to the land that they were born into. That this should be seen as a sacred right that is passed over generations. That all of the people who exist on this piece of land, it's a culture worth preserving, and that every people should have their own country, and that sometimes we should do policies that maybe in the short run hurt our god GDP but help the actual people, and that if just because our economy is growing, if it's at the expense of many people suffering, if we have way more homeless, if we have lack of social cohesion, if we, the metrics of success that the left talks about are, these types of things: poverty rates, homelessness, mental health. All of these things are actually real, right? I don't think the left has great ideas about how to solve them, but at least they're trying to. At least they admit that GDP alone, pipelines alone, are not going to save us. That we actually need to invest in our people for the long term. And so, I don't know, I think ultimately these are very interesting ideas that they're also very dangerous and very inflammatory, what is the word? Kind of like nitroglycerin, right? Because when you unleash the bottle of, white nationalism, racial nationalism, it's, the pendulum's going to swing the other way, is what I'm going to say, right? We're going to go from, whites are bad, we hate whites, whites are evil. What's the other side of that pendulum? Whites are the best, whites are superior, and we're going to show you, that we are too. And so that's where I think the pendulum is swinging. Hopefully we can, mitigate that a bit. I don't want, these are very powerful tropes and powerful themes that can really rally people up. I think for good, but also for bad. And so, for me, this is why I think people like Nick Fuentes are thriving. And I think even non-whites really appreciate this, because he's actually acknowledging, not like that race actually is a factor for all races, and that I think racially we should all advocate for our own interests, right? All the races are doing that, right? Muslims petition the government to make, mosques easier to build, and, Hindus and Indians do the same. All groups are trying to push for power in their self-interests. And I think it is time broadly that white people do the same. I just think that's a natural progression, and I think this self-hatred that whites have had, I'm glad it's coming to an end. But having said that, I think, we can get into some pretty spicy times here. So, I'd be curious what you guys think. This is just kind of how I see things progressing forward. Again, I don't think this is all bad. I think there is a lot of actually good in this raising of the consciousness. In a way, like, I still embody a lot of these ideas of the Enlightenment, like, in my one-to-one interactions. I treat everybody as equals until I see not to. But, it's hard when you have basically, like, Toronto is our biggest city. We have that amount of people a year coming into our country, and it's destabilizing. So it really will be pushed eventually to an us versus them situation. Unfortunately, I think that's part of the game too, to lead to this destabilization in countries, which will usher in some type of tyrannical control. So I actually think that is the end game, but I don't really, to be honest, at this point, I don't really have a solution to it, because I think these problems are so bad that the only thing you can do to an extent is to really stand up and fight for them. So this is, I'd be curious your guys' thoughts. Whether you're on the left or the right, my hope is at the very least we can bridge the gap and promote policies that actually do help our citizens first. And as much as I like Austrian economics, the idea, limited government in theory, I think no government is going that way. And they all have printing presses, and they're all going to keep printing money, and I don't think there's any way to get out of the debts that we're in. So ultimately, I think it's if the stick exists, let's use the stick for our good. And I think that's really the fundamental change that we need to promote, and to really think more on how we can actually help people in society. And I'm hoping that we can bridge that gap, because I think the left and the right now, I think the time is right to say, like, hey, what policies actually serve us first. Anyways, guys, that's it. I hope you enjoyed. Please please like and subscribe, and comment below what your thoughts are on this. I think it's a very interesting development. I think in some ways it's a very positive development, but as well, I think it's going to lead to some very interesting effects. So, without further ado, thanks for tuning in, and talk to you guys soon.